Many Guild Wars 2 players have expressed concerns that the most recent balance shift has ruined the game. While I can definitely sympathize with people having to learn a new class, a lot of these people were already spamming dead game anyways. So it's just truly unfounded, and you really shouldn't fall into the negativity that you find on the forums, by the way. This is just really a Purge patch more so than a balance patch. Even the devs mentioned to the community that the patch would definitely need fine-tuning and at first will have many issues. This is completely reasonable as it's been the largest balance patch since the game launched. Think of it like Noah's Ark. There were some big problems before, but for the most part, the fabric of society was still there. Then we drowned everything, and now we're in a much worse place, but we removed a lot of those problems in the process, and we can start working towards balancing the game again from the ground up. Personally, I blame those toxic elitists for why the gods left us. So what did the patch actually do? Well, over the years, Guild Wars 2 has been power crept with the trait change from the initial core game that added stats to everyone, and then elite specs obviously were another power creep. So what it did was it went back to lower stats from before any expansions were even in the game. They power crept that, and this means that people aren't going to be as bursty, right? So burst specs are going to be a lot less valuable, but also sustain is being dropped as well, and this means that damage is more meaningful. And now I know what you're thinking, right? But doesn't that make DPS builds imbalanced now? Sort of, yeah. DPS is a lot more valuable than it was before, but obviously burst is still a thing, and I think it's a little bit more of an even balance between DPS specs and burst specs. Slower paces also allow new players to get into the game mode because they can actually see what's happening and why they're dying, rather than just instantly dying and just not learning anything and then just leaving the game mode. So it's actually really healthy for the meta to be this way for the game, even if it's a less skillful state, which I don't think so anyways. I think it's harder to do damage, so players who are bad will have trouble dealing damage and not getting kills, while players who are skilled will know how to time their abilities and land their meaningful attacks, and to pressure a target and not let it get away after you've already invested time into killing it. The changes to make all power coefficients for CC skills 0.01 is a good start, but it ruined a lot of the flow of a class or build. For example, Hammer Warriors can keep someone stun locked for several seconds while doing almost no damage. So long as they don't land their one skill that does damage, which is the hammer too. It results in the feeling of, why should I even bother CCing someone if I could just land my one damaging skill instead? The recent balance patch has been a good change in philosophy, but the ideas are too simplified, which creates not only an imbalance, but a strange feeling. CC skills doing no damage is a bit extreme. There are more than one type of CC skills, obviously. There are instant cast CC skills with massive tells, CC skills with very long cooldowns, or with very long range. I agree that instant CC skills should be very low damage, but there are skills which are very situational, or hard to land, or risky to attempt to land, or which simply look like they should deal damage, which should not be punished as hard in the damage that they do. For example, Dragon's Maw is an elite skill with a decent cooldown that looks pretty cool and is also risky to place, but it has a really strong CC. it should do decent damage. Prime Light Beam is an elite skill that is easy to land, long range, unblockable, but it also has sort of a decent tell. So maybe it shouldn't be as strong as it was before, but it also looks really, really cool. So it should at least do some damage. Big ol' bomb, hard to land, massive tell, it should do some damage. Headshot, low risk, decent range, decent spammability, almost instant cast, it does no damage. Earthen Synergy, the Weaver Scepter Earthen Air 3, has almost no tell to it, is long range, and has no risk to using it. Should probably deal very little damage. Warrior Hammer 4, relatively quick, has a short tell, does a small CC, but also requires risky positioning. Maybe it shouldn't do that much damage, but it should do some. Warrior Hammer 5, massive tell, cast time, requires risky positioning, but it's a super long CC. It should deal decent damage. Also, weapons should have more than 1 or 2 skills that deal damage, or it just feels like a deadweight weapon. For example, Hammer on Guardian only has 2 skills that deal damage, so you go on the Hammer weapon set, and you use your 1 skill, and then it's on a high cooldown, and now you're auto-attacking for the rest of the time. As I mentioned before, if a skill looks like it has a huge tell, and looks cool, it should feel good, and rewarding to land, because it's a game, and balance is secondary to the fun of the game. With the whole game changing in balance, there are some things that are not tied to profession skills that haven't been looked at. For example, pressing F on a downed ally is still just as fast, and it was always faster than a stomp with 0 cleave, so rezzing has been buffed. If we're gonna stay with these levels of damage, then maybe rezzing shouldn't be as strong. So one of the major features that came out with this patch is also the 2v2 game mode. It's finally here, and it has a matchmaking system that you can queue into. However, it isn't permanent. 2v2 queues were a massive addition to Guild Wars 2 PvP and shouldn't be ignored like Stronghold, which was potentially a really good game mode, and to be honest, still can't be. If left unbalanced and unchanged for a while, or not left in the game and removed because it's part of mini-seasons, ArenaNet will be missing out on a huge opportunity to grow their user base. 2v2 or deathmatch is something that many people have been looking forward to, and they had it at one point, but it was a really bad like 5v5 thing that wasn't really designed. But now that we have a really well designed 2v2 system, the balance of the game mode is really important, and the balance issues of Conquest also become apparent in 2v2. Obviously there will be some things that rise to the top of the 2v2 meta that aren't as harmful in Conquest, because Conquest has much more counterplay to it with rotations. But some people are claiming that 2v2 can never be balanced because Conquest exists, and that ArenaNet will never and should never cater to that smaller audience. I disagree wholeheartedly. Look at the most broken classes in 2v2 right now. Necros with high sustain, Condi Revs, and Firebrands. Those are all some of the biggest threats in Conquest as well. The commonality between all these classes is that their sustain mostly comes from something outside their heal skill. Or in the case of Revenant, it just has 2 heal skills, even with both of them being nerfed. There's still much more value than the other classes' 1 heal skill. Necromancers gaining tons of passive healing from lifesteal, which also hasn't been nerfed, and Shroud generation, which really hasn't been nerfed, allows them to have insane sustain. Firebrands, while their damage is based on symbols which are very counterplayable, they're still giving out too many boons, too many debilitating conditions, and way too many crowd controls that allow them to push out that symbol damage without the others being able to counterplay it. Core symbol guardians don't really have this issue, so yeah, it's clearly a firebrand issue, not a symbol issue. So what is something that we can immediately do to address these balance issues, right? Because when Pro League came out for Guild Wars 2, it could have been really huge, but because balance was really slow, it ended up kind of flopping, and a lot of sponsors kind of left the scene because the game looked like it wasn't competitive. But the game was. It's just that the balance wasn't there. So obviously there's going to be a ton of things that need to be done still to build up from Noah's Ark, but let's start with the immediate threats to keep the 2v2 scene alive, right? First, they need to remove the CC on the axe trait for the axe symbol in Firebrand. They need to remove blind from the Mantra of Truth because there's way too much blind spam, and lowering the range of the axe pull on the axe 3 because it allows them to basically prevent people from getting out of their symbols too easily. For Revenants, I would cap the amount of healing the Glint heal can do, since it converts damage, not just healing, right? So it prevents damage, which is already an insane mechanic, even with the lowered power creep. And I would also reduce the amount of healing they can get from the Retribution Grandmaster Steadfast Rejuvenation, because upkeep skills are, in some builds, too versatile, so you just get so much value from constantly keeping them up and gaining sustain constantly while also doing what you already wanted to do. Also, with corruption builds, a Revenant can become almost immune to conditions using transfers and resistance uptime. Resistance is a boon that is balanced by its scarcity, but in comparison with protection, it's way stronger for Revenants who can basically spam this out. And in essence, I would just lower the uptime that they can get from resistance and reduce the number of conditions they can transfer from the Grandmaster in Corruption. Also, the Malix Elite does way too much damage for being a pulsing AoE that moves around with you. For Necromancers, reduce the amount of Shroud generated while the Necromancer is in Shroud to force them to leave Shroud and use their actual health pool more riskily. Or they can stay in Shroud for extended periods of time and lose some of their resource generation. Obviously there are counters to these classes, but because MMO combat is a game of resources, these classes require much more resources to play around in general, thus being overpowered. There are other balance anomalies like Rangers doing 8k mauls with a low cooldown, Call to Anguish having too wide of a range, and Shocking Aura being oppressive now that stability is scarce, but this would require too long a list for this video. Next I want to talk about World vs. World. It's actually seen many improvements because of the balance patch, and I would say it actually got the better end. However, there are still exclusive sigils and food that exist, so damage is still going to be higher in World vs. World, but it feels kind of good there. I would consider nerfing sigils like Hydromancy and Doom to do less damage, and any other sigil effect that overperforms to be on that level. So Cleansing Sigil can be reduced from 3 to 2 cleanses, and Celerity can be reduced from 5 seconds of quickness to 3, for example. And once we have all of these new game modes, it's important that there is some sort of end game in mind, right? So like in most MMOs, you have some sort of thing that you're working towards, that you're grinding for. Obviously the game itself should be fun and intrinsic, but there needs to be some sort of extrinsic reward as well. And that's why I think that legendary armor in PvP and World vs. World is kind of like this weird thing where there's no skin to it, it's just functionality only. I think that there should be an actual unique skin to the legendary armors that you can obtain in World vs. World and PvP, and that will first of all bring a lot of players to PvP. And you could also do something really cool where you could make the skin of the PvP or World vs. World. They could be two separate skins, or they could be the same one. The more the merrier. But there could be some like mist kind of theme to it, like you're not from Tyria, you're from the mists. And it would have to be something that isn't too flashy, but would look good. So you could maybe do like a infrequent kind of like animation or jolt of like mist. While the Warclaw and balance update were very good for the gameplay of World vs. World, the actual game mode of World vs. World still lacks a reason to play it, because winning your matchup is meaningless. So there needs to be like seasons or some kind of incentive to actually play World vs. World. And I know not everyone goes into World vs. World to win the matchup, right? Some people are just fine with doing whatever, and that's completely fine. But to a lot of people, that will promote them to actually play the game mode, right? Is for winning to be meaningful. Other than that, the patch is really good, and I really want to see it keep going in this direction. We just need to have constant balance like this ongoing, and we'll be in a pretty good spot. And guys, remember, like this video and subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment down below if you think that the balance patch was good, if you think it was bad, if you think you're gonna uninstall the game, or if you think everything is gonna be fine. Let me know in the comments below.